everybody. Welcome to the LegendHaven 2023 conference, Worlds Without End. I'm Katy Campbell, and this is Joe Campbell, who I'm married to. and,
Hello.
and we are both writers. So I am a humor writer who does fairy tale retellings and sort of satirical fantasies. So I've written this book and a couple other books. Joe has a book on the way. He is book pregnant.
I am most of the way through, fingers crossed, on my first draft of my first novel. I have written some short stories though, and I have a whole website, so I'm working my way up. Katie's got more of a head start over me right now.
So anyway, today's topic is something that we like to rant to each other about, and we've heard a lot of talk on the community, online, just in the Christian world in general, and that topic is mature content and how to handle mature content as a Christian artist. So just to let you know, we're not going to be going into graphic details or anything during this discussion, but we might use words like sex. So if you have small children in the room, might put some earbuds in. I'll leave that to the parental discretion of them. So, Joe, what is mature content, and what do you have to say about it as a Catholic writer and filmmaker?
Oh man. Well, right off the bat, Katie, most of the stuff that you've written has been aimed at kind of a young adult audience, adolescent audience.
YA, with the exception of Canadian Nights, which is just general adult.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've been leaning a little bit more on the adult fiction. So I have written some stuff with some swearing, some violence, some allusions to sexuality. So this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit over the past year. And it's been interesting seeing the reactions of different people. I've shown my writing to different Catholics, just kind of figuring out for myself where this line where the line is, as far as especially R-rated content, because it is something that you hear about quite a bit. I know one thing I heard about even before I was writing was some people would tell me about the little bit of crap in the cake ruins the entire cake, and I thought, like, is that true necessarily?
Well, with cake it is, but as
Yeah.
the analogy applies to writing, I just want to make that very clear before we go any further.
Yeah. um Yeah, and that's the problem with a lot of these analogies to begin with, is that it's like this not a one-to-one thing, because I have seen movies that I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everybody, read books that I wouldn't recommend to everybody, especially teenagers. But I feel like I've known a lot of Christians who would just dismiss them entirely, and I found some very beautiful truths and even if they're not explicitly Christian, some very human themes in some of these stories that I feel like a lot of people are dismissing based on the subject matter. And to be fair, you have to know your own limits. You have to know what you're comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
But my problem is more with dismissing them entirely for everyone and saying, no, this is sinful to read this book,
Mm-hmm.
even if the book has something of merit, because it has something problematic in it, whether that's a sex scene or some gratuitous violence. And I take it more on the idea that we have to take it on a case by case basis. I don't think you can dismiss everything outright.
Mm-hmm.
But where is that line? That's what we're here to discuss today.
Yeah, and we want to make sure that this is more of a discussion and not Joe and I being like the authority figures, rather than like a talk. Because where my boundaries are might not be the same as where Joe's boundaries are or where your boundaries are. And I think as Catholics, it's very important for us to approach this prayerfully, to approach this with spiritual direction from wise people, um, and to apply the virtue of prudence when we look at how do I apply mature content into a book I'm writing, a movie I'm making. How do I handle it, and does it point towards God?
I think that right there is the big point. Is where is this writing pointing? If it's just there to shock and abhor and titillate and all, it's like, well, okay, that's kind of the point where you're thinking, well, why are you writing this and what are you trying to accomplish with it? Because there have been plenty of stories that have come from very true, raw, honest experiences. Especially, I feel like in a lot of Christian circles, Christian families, autobiographical work gets kind of more of a pass if it has more explicit content in it because it is based on real experiences. And the
Hmm.
argument there, of course, is that, well, this is life. This is true life. These things happened and to this person, and this story needs to be told. And my thought is, well, we don't all have those experiences, but we know, what it's like to be human, and we've heard these stories, and we know these themes are worth repeating.
Hmm.
So why can't we apply some of those to our fiction?
I always look to the Bible for inspiration in portraying human behavior honestly. God, in the Bible, the writers are never like, "Oh, we can't show people doing this. We can't show, illicit sex. We can't show, you know, problematic like violence and stuff." The Bible is extremely R-rated, and the writers never hold back from saying, they had, he had relations with so and so, right? They just say it how it is, and it's not written in a way that's like, lusty and arousing, but it is written in a very matter of fact. This is how people are, and this is how people behave. And I think it's very important to remember as Christian writers that depiction does not equal condonement. Now, I've heard actually from a number of Christians, well, this is in the Bible, so it's okay. So, for example, I guess the most extreme example is I've heard people justify polygamy because there's polygamy in the Bible. Well, the matriarchs and the patriarchs in the Bible do things sometimes earlier in the Bible that are later in Leviticus and in Leviticus condemned, right? So you couldn't, for example, in one of the law books, I think it was Leviticus, they condemn like sleeping with your sister, marrying like your sister or a close relation, whereas we know that Abraham and Sarah were brother and sister. So you can't just look at everything the matriarchs and the patriarchs do and say, that's okay. You need to exercise that virtue of prudence, and you need to work under the guidance of the church and the church fathers to make that determination. And in the same way, when we depict things in our books, we have to use some prudence there. It's like, what am I trying to say with this? And does it make sense for it to be there in that case?
Now, here's my question: is we talked about using the subject matter to reflect humanity and teach values.
Mm.
What about in just using it in uh not necessarily using graphic subject matter for entertainment value, but using it not in a way, say you're writing a book and you don't have any high-minded themes. You're just trying to write a gripping work of fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and it's R-rated.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of something along the lines of, I mean, again, I keep coming back to this Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter of Mars series. Lots of, very lightweight reading, lots of graphic violence in those books. That's early 1900s. Is it sinful to write or read subject matter that isn't necessarily religious or thematically rich necessarily, but still is R-rated, has R-rated content in it?
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is one, again, I'm not going to answer anything authoritatively. And I would invite viewers to please put your thoughts on Joe's question in the comments or, in the AMA afterwards. Um, but I think it's a little bit different when we talk about violence and when we talk about sexual content, right? Because the sexual act is, something very sacred and something that is supposed to be a reflection of the Blessed Trinity and a life giving union. So for example, my line when it comes to sexual content in books is I won't write something that a sexually healthy person would find arousing, right? So I have stuff in my books where sex is implied. Both licit and illicit sex is implied in my books in various ways. Um, but I don't go into descriptions that are pornographic, right? I don't describe things that would lead somebody to start having impure thoughts and then to, desire to temptation of illicit sex. And I think that that's right. I think that that's a little bit different than violence when John Carter splits the alien in twain and watches its green innards gush forth. Like, no one's going to read that and then immediately run out and start hacking people up unless there's something really mentally wrong with them. So I think violence and sex are a little bit different. I do think you can go over, definitely be gratuitous and dark with violence, but I think some over the top violence is more like cartoony, and I don't really have a problem with that depending on like who your audience is.
Yeah, yeah, and I was thinking about this because again, in the book I'm working on, uh, again, there's R-rated language, R-rated violence, and there is some sexual content in the book I'm writing too. But I've been trying not to get. Well, I'm not trying as if it's been difficult, but I've been thinking about because I do have characters that are not don't have a healthy view of sexuality.
Right.
And these characters aren't always portrayed as being just, villainous scumbag characters. They're often shown as being complicated, often broken people who just grew up in a worldview that just wasn't healthy, especially in regards to sexuality. And I want to be very upfront about that, and I want to be very honest and open about that. And I also want to show some of the ugliness of what this kind of worldview can lead to. But like you said, Katie, I also want to make sure I'm not getting graphic. I don't want to start writing titillating material. So it's been kind of interesting trying to figure out. Well, okay, I'm okay with I'm okay with an F-bomb. I'm okay with graphic violence, but well, and I also want to honestly portray these characters as they should be shown, because I do think it is healthy to explore some of these broken worldviews, as long as you're coming from a healthy viewpoint to begin with. I always think that if you're coming at your writing from a very centered, godly worldview, and you keep that in mind the whole time, then I think that will come through in your writing, even when you're writing about ugliness.
Right. And, the Bible and, many other stories that have tragic content in them, um, they're all about God working through human brokenness and human darkness. And there's a bunch of really great stories out there that, they show some disturbing stuff, and they might not be for everyone, right? I have certain lines of like movies I will not watch and books I will not read, but they might be really good for other people, because they show how God's grace can work in a character who's broken and confused.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what a lot of Christian media is missing is that honest depiction of human nature, right?
Yes.
I've seen a lot of Christian movies, a lot of Christian books where all the Christians are like the ideal Christian, right? They're all super goody two shoes, like pure, don't even drop like any mild swears, they're perfect. And then the non-Christian characters are the ones that are evil, but they're usually like cartoony evil, like not even like complex dark characters. And I think that that's dishonest. That's not only is it not interesting, not only is it preachy and cheesy, it's dishonest about who humans are.
Yeah, I think, graphic content aside, I do think that more Christian writers need to be portraying complicated characters. Humans are messy. We're messy. I say messy characters.
We are messy characters.
We're messy. We often get pulled in different ways. I think using personal vices can be a really interesting way to explore that in your writing. If you're struggling with something that you haven't fully figured out yet, maybe put that into one of your characters and see where that takes them and how do they approach it.
Yeah, it can be really therapeutic to do
It can. I'm not saying always. Don't make all your fiction autobiographical, but I have found it helpful at times to make a character, even just to make a character more interesting. To
Right.
take maybe like a qualm I know that I have, like a vice that I have, and say, "Hey, let's put that into this character because I know that vice well, and it'll make the character more interesting, and it'll add a struggle to them."
Hmm. Yeah, very often in the books I write, I'm exploring some own interior journey that I've had, right? Um, yeah, so it's kind of an interesting thing to figure out. I know I can say what my personal rules are with regard to my writing, keeping in mind that I write most of my books, I call them for about a young adult audience, so I'm okay with stuff like mild swearing, like implied sex but nothing graphic. Things like that, depending on the situation, I'm okay with. So my line for sexual content is again nothing that a sexually healthy person would find arousing. And I say sexually healthy because if somebody is not sexually healthy, they could find anything arousing. So I can't hold myself to,
Yeah, and there's
yeah,
that's kind of the other part of this is how much is it on the writer's responsibility and how much is it on the reader's responsibility? Because we as Christians have a responsibility to not put ourselves in a place where we know we will be in a near occasion of sin. If you know that even slightly risque subject matter can be arousing to you, you should be staying away from that anyway. That doesn't mean that writers shouldn't be writing about sex and stories.
right, right, because it's in real life, right? It's part of human life, and ideally it's a good and a beautiful and wonderful part of human life, and not something we should always be like, ah, we don't want to talk about
Yeah.
that, right?
On the other hand, it's on us as Catholic and Christian authors to be mindful of the material we're writing and make sure what writing about mature subject matter, but not writing about it in a way that I want to say in a way that could be sinful, but it's it could be sinful to other people. But again, that depends on where you're coming at. So just be mindful that you're not writing titillating material, and especially just for the sake of titillating material.
Right, just for the sake of getting like hormones pumping in your
Yeah.
reader, like sexual hormones specifically. If you're getting them excited about something, then that could be a really good thing as a writer. You want to engage those emotions, but just be careful which ones you're
Yeah, yeah,
trying to
exactly.
engage and why.
How much detail you're going into, and you can write something that may seem fine on the first draft, and going through in the second draft, you can see like, oh, okay, this might be perceived a little bit differently and a little bit more arousing than I expected it to. Let's tone it back without losing the point.
Right. And that's why it's important to have, fellow Christian beta readers, which is what the legend fiction community is fantastic for, is to say like, "Hey, I wrote this. Do you think that this scene goes too far?" It's really good to have that feedback. I know for me, none of well, I shouldn't say none of my books get too violent because the Canadian Knights I've gotten in trouble for, but I consider that it's really kind of Looney Tunes violence. Like it's not meant to be realistic, and none of it's graphic. But there is some over the top in Canadian Knights. Um, Again, though, I'm doing that to just kind of be absurd. Like it's not meant to be
Y-
like.
Yeah, I'm a fan of horror movies. I write. There's quite a bit of violence in some of the stuff that I've written. My thought on violence is it's it's again what is the point of the violence? If I think it gets to be more problematic when you get to be more sadistic for the sake of being sadistic.
Right.
I mean, I think it can be great to put a character through the ringer and show them going through tremendous pain and agonizing stuff. War books go through this in great graphic detail all the time. Excellent books. Uh, but in horror, I mean, I could go off on horror all day because this is not what that's not what this talk is on. But there there can be a temptation to make your villains really, really despicable and showing them doing some of this really nasty stuff, which is great and it can be really effective. But
Hmm.
at a certain point, you need to ask yourself, how far is this really necessary? How far are you just kind of exploiting the violence at a certain point? I
Hmm.
like me a little bit of shock value, but I don't like to make it feel yucky
You
and
don't want people to be like delighting in the violence
exactly,
itself.
exactly. Which is also, I mean, revenge movies. Revenge movies can be a lot of fun, but that gets to the point where are you cheering your hero doing really despicable, violent stuff? You know?
Yeah, and I find myself often with revenge movies like really rooting for the hero and then like checking myself like, what am I doing? This is not a good person.
Yeah. So I mean, and again, even there does get to be as you said a Looney Tunes kind of point where it just kind of becomes comedy. I mean, really, a lot of comedy, especially classic comedies. Look at the Three Stooges, going way back then. A lot of comedy is rooted in violence, and some movies and books take that to a more extreme level. And I think that's it. I think that's okay. It just again, how are you engaging with the material? Are you laughing at the absurdity, or are you delighting in the the pain and the violence itself?
Yeah, well, if we look at movies like Hot Fuzz, which is a very R-rated, fantastic movie, but definitely not for everyone. But that movie is so over the top violence, but they do it to a point where it's ridiculous. It's like completely unrealistic, and that's kind of the point of the comedy of that movie. So that I don't really have a problem with, right? Um, the other one that comes up a lot is swearing, right? And this is one, first of all, this is one where I draw a very hard line on God's name. So I will not, even if it's like a villainous character or a character who doesn't care about using Jesus' specific name in vain, I will not, I just don't show that in the book because Jesus' name is sacred, and I don't feel like even for the sake of a piece of art or a piece of literature, it's worth it's worth showing that it's worth desecrating his name for a piece of entertainment. Now, I might be wrong. I don't know. That's how I feel about it. I just don't feel comfortable with that. And I go even more extreme where I won't even have like an oh my god. I always write around it, and sometimes it's a big pain in the butt because it feels like that's the natural thing someone would say. But I just want to make sure. I just feel like in modern society we take God's name so lightly all the time, and we've kind of forgotten that God's name is sacred, and it's more sacred than the stories I'm writing, right? As good as they are. That might be an extreme. That's the most extreme rule I get, I think. And I think you have a little slightly different rule on that than I do.
This is one where I'm honestly still trying to figure this out, and I don't know where the line is. And I've asked some people before, like, okay, where's the line on this? In the book that in some of the stuff that I've written so far, there are vulgarities,
Mm-hmm.
f words, s words, all that. And I have had characters say, oh my god, use God's name in vain a couple of times, but I've been drawing the line as specifically, Jesus's name when you get very specific because the characters that I've written so far that feels honest to them, and even though I want to, on the one hand, Jesus's name and God's name is very, we should be respecting it and we should be modeling that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are people who talk coarsely and roughly and vulgarly. Um, so I've been kind of trying to figure out where that line is because I want to be again true to the characters in the if I was writing something for a younger audience,
Mm-hmm.
I probably would be I'd be reining it back a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the line where I've drawn is just kind of some characters I give them the benefit of the doubt of, well, I don't know what their god is.
Yeah.
But again, I don't quite know where the line is. So yeah, that's one that I'm still trying to figure out. And yeah, when it comes to very specifically Jesus's name and some of the saints,
Once you start getting specific beyond
yeah,
just God, which is way less specific,
yeah.
right?
Oh, Poseidon,
Oh my god, their god's Poseidon, right? So
Yeah,
it's like
exactly. Exactly. And there and a lot of these characters, I'm writing this, I'm like, well, these characters very deliberately, they don't have any sort of religious
Mhm.
beliefs or whatever,
Mhm.
So to them, it does mean nothing. But to me, as the writer, it means something. So it's kind of that battle I'm having.
Yeah, with other swearing for me, like, F-bombs, I that is a little bit different. That I try to be realistic for my audience. Since I'm writing young adult books for the most part, the worst I get is like hell and
Yeah,
damn.
you keep it pretty
I
PG-13 in
keep it
your
very
yeah.
PG. I haven't dropped an F bomb except I wrote a short story where I comedically like blurred out all the F bombs, but it was kind of like part of the joke. And I'm writing a middle school book right now where I'm even tamer because it's middle school. I use like darn and heck,
Yeah.
which is like very soft, but it's for kids, so I figured that's a good way to do it. But it's so some of the content you show obviously is going to depend on your audience.
Yeah, yeah. I think vulgarities tend to be. I mean, they can be sinful in the case of if you're using them uncharitably around people who you shouldn't be.
Yeah.
But as far as writing fiction, if you're writing fiction for adults, I don't. I mean, I may be in the wrong about this. I don't have as much of a problem with writing vulgarities as I do with writing blasphemies.
Yeah, totally the same. And I also think it's a little bit different when it comes to like derogatory terms
Mm.
about like, about gender or race or things like that. Those I'm like, okay, if a hero's like, or if if a villain is like really really racist or really really sexist, it might make sense for them to say some kind of an offensive word, but I don't like I want to be a lot more intentional about how I would portray those kinds of bad words. Whereas you might just have like a blue collar worker who's like dropping F bombs every other word, and the book is for adults. And if you go into any blue collar neighborhood everywhere, that's how it's going to sound in real life. Like, that I don't care about as much.
Yeah, and it's not portrayal is not if you're portraying this kind of stuff, you're not condoning it. I mean, again, if you're trying to portray blue collar workers, you're not as the writer, you're not saying this is how they should talk. I
Right.
mean, on the one hand, you do want to model good behavior yourself, but some people will pick up that book and they'll read it and they'll say this is just not realistic and just put it down.
Yeah. So, on this topic, Joe, any final thoughts? What do you want to leave the people with as something to think about or discuss?
Uh, well, I say run your writing by other Christian authors and readers and get their opinions. See, if you're wondering, am I crossing any lines? Show it to some other people. Don't be afraid to have someone tell you that you've gone too far, because if you just put it out there and then you find out later you've gone too far, then you got a problem. Show it to people you trust ahead of time.
Hmm.
But also, don't be afraid to tackle mature subject matter. If you're writing something for adults or an older audience, or just be mindful about how you're using it, but
Hmm.
don't be afraid to use it.
Right. Mhm. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And I would say remember the virtue of prudence. The virtue of prudence is the virtue that says how you should apply the virtues in real world scenarios, right? And so think about that in your writing. How do I show the virtue of chastity in this book? Is my character going to make some mistakes? Are they going to learn at the end? Maybe I'm trying to show the virtue of fortitude, and that requires, an unchaste character to fall a whole bunch of times, but then come out triumphant at the end. So make sure that you're really thinking about that. Get advice from wise people, and obviously make sure that you're staying close to God yourself and praying a lot about what the right thing is to do, because God's going to help you and God's going to guide you to make good decisions. So, good advice, prayer, discernment, prudence. That's what I say.
I hope you're writing this all down.
You better remember this. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts, your opinions. If you disagree with us, if you think we're too strict, if you think we're going too far, if you think we're a bunch of depraved, crazy people, tell us.
Which we might be.
Maybe we are. Maybe we're too far gone, Joe. Anyway, go ahead and leave a comment, or meet up with us at the conference, and we would love to chat with you further. Thank you so much for listening in, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.